In 1861, President Abraham Lincoln went to war with the Southern states who had seceded from the Union to once and for all settle the question of slavery in what would easily become the greatest episode in American history, the American Civil War. Hi, welcome back to the Homeschool History Show. I'm Mr. Wesley. This week, we will be dealing with the most important and foundational event of American history, the Civil War. What is that? Civil kind of means to be peaceful and behave, and war is anything but being peaceful and behaving. So what gives? What's a civil war? Well, a civil war means a war amongst the citizens, between the citizens of a country. You may remember the War of 1812 and the American Revolution. These are the two wars we've covered so far. Who were we fighting? Anybody? Parents? Who were we fighting? Who were we fighting? Correct, the British.
Oh, no.
This time, we're fighting ourselves. That's right. The southern states that want to keep slaves and the northern states that want to get rid of slavery fight one another. Brother against brother, father against son. Terrible stuff, but a major important event. So, why was the Civil War so important? Well, as stated, we finally dealt with the issue of slavery, which ran very much against this idea that everybody is free and equal. 3 million Americans participated in the American Civil War. 2% of the entire U.S. population, about 680,000 people, died. In 2 days at the Battle of Shiloh, more Americans were killed than in all of the other wars we had fought up to that point combined. There was nobody in the country that wasn't touched by this event. The single bloodiest day of the war was the Battle of Antietam, in which over 23,000 Americans died. That's twice as many as in the Battle of D-Day in World War II, which we'll get there later. There's a very important thing to understand about the American Civil War. Remember, this is about the states that stayed with the country and the states that seceded. As it would turn out, which states in particular decided to secede determined everything afterwards. In particular, we're going to look very carefully at the state of Virginia. Virginia was the first of the English colonies. That's where the Jamestown colony was. It's named after the Virgin Queen Elizabeth, Virginia. Anyway, that state had a very famous general from it named Robert E. Lee. Everybody on the North and the South understood that Lee was the greatest general the United States had. Personally, Lee was not really heavy into slavery, or he just kind of decided what the politicians want is okay. But his home state of Virginia chose to leave the Union. Robert E. Lee very famously said, I cannot draw my sword against my own state. Meaning he would not fight people that he knew. He would not fight his own family, his own state. And for that reason, Lee joined the South. This imbalance in leadership caused great difficulties for the North in the early stages of the war. In fact, the North could not find an effective general with which to fight Lee until Ulysses S Grant came onto the scene. Now, Ulysses Grant was a very controversial figure. He kind of had a drinking problem and some personal issues. There's a famous quote when the Senate, some of the politicians said, Mr. Lincoln, President Lincoln, you can't put this man in charge of the army. He drinks too much. President Lincoln famously responded, find out what he's drinking so I can give it to all of my generals. Because Grant was successful. You see, Lee would strike and run away and strike and run away and hide in the woods. And that would scare the Northern generals. They'd regroup and hide and come up with a different plan. Grant didn't play that. He didn't play that game. He chased down the South, no matter what, and kept fighting and fighting and fighting. This was terrible. This led to all sorts of death and destruction, and it was the darkest moment in American history. But he understood that in order to defeat the South, you had to make life uncomfortable for the South. By making life uncomfortable for the South, eventually the Southern people lost their will to fight, their desire to fight the North. In addition to trying to defeat the South on the battlefield, General Sherman very famously marched to Atlanta, destroying everything on the way. Houses, barns, buildings, factories, silos, you name it. If it was Southern, he was going to destroy it until there was nothing left and they stopped the fight. In addition to having great human, social, and political consequences in the United States, the American Civil War also led to economic explosion. Technology during this time period increased. Patents, that's when you invent something and you say, hey, this is my invention, nobody else can make it, exploded during the Civil War. And Europe stood by and looked on in shock and awe as for the first time ever, 2 iron battleships, the Monitor and the Merrimac, engaged in combat. For the first time ever, a ship wasn't made out of wood and cannonballs would simply bounce off of it. The Southern economy in the war was less powerful than 1/4 of just the state of New York alone. So the South relied on superior fighting abilities, like I said, going into the woods, hunting, running, hiding. And eventually, it all came to a head in 1863 in Pennsylvania at the Battle of Gettysburg, when the South reached its biggest attack on the North and was turned away. After 1863, for the last 2 years of the war, between 1863 and 1865, the South would never advance again. They were on the retreat. So after 4 bloody years of war, all kinds of chaos, all kinds of death, and all kinds of technological advancement, finally, the South would be brought to its knees and slavery would be ended once and for all on the North American continent. So we may look back at this period of slavery as being terribly barbaric, which it was. But there's another thing to keep in mind. The British Empire was the first ever in the history of the world to abolish slavery. And only a few short decades later, this Civil War occurred, which is the first and only time in American history, first and only time in world history, that a country went to war with itself in order to stop something as evil as slavery. Despite the mistakes this country may have made and continues to make, despite the work that we can still all take part in trying to do to make all the world a better place, every single American should be very proud of the legacy of the Civil War. Because this is a time when we finally put our money where our mouth was, risked our lives, fought the hard fight to live up to the principles of freedom and equality that this country is founded on. For these reasons and many more, the Civil War is arguably the greatest moment in American history. Stay tuned. Until next time, I'm History.